Hey everyone, I'm Lilia from Territory 3, recently rebranded from Kiwi Landing Pad, so Kiwi Landing Pad Reimagined now. And today we've got Kyle Campbell from CTO.ai. Kyle is based in were you in the US or Canada?
I'm in Vancouver, Canada.
Yeah, Canada at the moment, which is awesome to have an international guest for today. And essentially, yeah, he's just going to give us a bit of a backstory of what he's been up to in the startup world, a bit of information on CTO.ai, and topic is, of course, around leveling up your DevOps team. So welcome to Kyle, and I'd love to hand over to you to do a bit of an intro.
Yeah. So I'll maybe kick it off and share my story, my journey, if you will, maybe from the beginning, and then I'll share all my failures as well as some of my successes. If there's things that people want me to zoom in on more, please do ask the question, and we can kind of circle back to it, and I can dig into specific things. But generally, what I was hoping to be able to share with people is just my journey as a startup founder, especially a technical startup founder. Overcoming certain limitations, whether it's funding, and effectively still building the highest quality technology teams possible. And one of the strategies, that are often used in this is what's called DevOps. And so we won't go too deep into DevOps unless there's, technical people in the group who want to kind of talk about that. But I think more importantly, what we'll talk about is hopefully some of the methodologies that can help you to create an impact on your product and do so despite what stage of business you're at. So I'll just start with a little bit of my story, who I am. Based in Vancouver, Canada. CTO is actually probably like my 12th or 13th startup. It's my fourth kind of officially. I came into the tech scene very early. So I grew up in Nova Scotia, which is a small province in Canada, known more for corn than for creating technology products. And I actually did graduate high school. I dropped out of high school in grade 10. I was really into open source and technology from a very young age. And I sort of pursued that instead of graduating or going through. So I'm a self-taught software engineer. As well as an entrepreneur. I started my first business actually when I was 16, and my first internet business when I was about 17. So both of those businesses had to do with music. I was very involved in creating online communities early on in my journey. And this would have been sort of around the .com era, a little bit before. I left the high school scenario going into tech primarily because I just wasn't particularly interested in learning all of those other subjects. The internet was very interesting. Entrepreneurship was very interesting. And with programming, I was able to learn a lot just from the open source community. So I pursued that. And I actually found myself in just around the .com era. I found myself at one of the earliest hosting providers, a company called Hostopia that was based in Toronto, Canada. And what we did back then was it was sort of the early era of building servers and building hosting platforms. We now think of them as development platforms or cloud platforms. And Hostopia was pretty interesting. And what it focused on was trying to create really accessible solutions for the average SMB business to host a website. And what we would do is we would white label those hosting platforms through large telcos. Someone like a Verizon, which is a large telecom company here in the US, or Rogers, which is one of the large telecoms in Canada. And what they would do is they would then sell those hosting solutions to their SMB customers. But these SMB customers typically were not what I would call like super tech savvy. They would have a web developer, maybe a webmaster is what we called it back then. And so that was my sort of first foray into the idea of DevOps and what DevOps is. And the way I thought about it was, simplicity is what makes this technology super powerful and accessible. And we were able to build quite a successful business around that. The company IPO'd in about maybe a year after I joined. I was too young to know what an IPO was. When they called me up and said, "Hey, do you want to purchase your options?" I didn't have the $10,000 to give them. And so that was my sort of first lesson about liquidity in the tech game. And I watched everyone else make a lot of money. I left shortly thereafter, but it was a good sort of experience to understand, how building these technology platforms can lead to really material outcomes. And so that was sort of in the early mid 2000s. I then pursued working in more agencies and more startups, and I bounced between a couple of different roles in Toronto. Eventually moved to Vancouver. In Vancouver, I started working for a company called Blast Radius, which at the time was one of the largest agencies in the world. They worked quite often, and then shortly thereafter were acquired for about $300 million by Wonderman. And in that environment, I really got to hone my craft as a senior software engineer and tech lead. I would focus on building projects for global brands, work for companies like Land Rover, Nike. The list goes on. Very, very, even Starbucks was an interesting one. But what would happen is we build these projects in very short time frames. And so, you'd build a project, it would be on a short time frame, a short budget, you'd move on to the next one. And that was a really good experience because it helped us to really understand how to create value very rapidly on short time frames. But after a little while, nothing that you launch stands the test of time. So obviously, I looked at that one and also moved on. Around that time, I started getting really interested in entrepreneurship again. And so I joined a few different startups. There was one here in Vancouver called Real House that was focusing on a creator community that was sort of a competitor to Vimeo. And then after that, I started working more for Bay Area companies. And at the time, I was doing a lot of consulting work here in Vancouver for companies out of San Francisco and Silicon Valley. And one particular opportunity came around with a company called Data Hero. And it turned out that the founder, Chris Newman, was actually from here in Vancouver. And I started working with Chris to help him build this company, Data Hero. And Data Hero at the time raised some funding from Founders Fund, Brad Feld, and some really legitimate investors who were based out of Colorado, I believe, but quite well known. And I went through the process for about a year of helping Chris and his team. I also worked with somebody named Gail Yui, who's now our VP of product, and Chris is one of our board members about 7 years later here. And we basically built Data Hero. About a year into that, I sort of had an opportunity to go to Shanghai, work on a really interesting project for a company over there. And I kind of came to Chris and I said, hey, look, I'm going to take this opportunity. And when I get back, I think I'm going to start my own startup. And Chris was really supportive and kind of helped me pursue that. So I left, went to Shanghai on a 3-week contract. That was a super tight timeline. We delivered some really awesome work with a small team. And when I came back, I decided to start my first startup, which was called Retzly. And Retzly was meant to solve a pretty major problem within the real estate industry in North America. The problem that it was meant to solve was in North America, getting access to real estate data is very difficult. It's very time consuming for software engineers to build products in the real estate sector. And the reason for this is that the data that most real estate companies need to access sits inside of what's called an MLS database. Now, if there was one database, this wouldn't be a big problem, but unfortunately, there's about 700 of them in North America and about 3,300 public records county, and sort of the list goes down. This goes on. And across these different databases, the data is very different. And so the result was most companies would be spending about $1 million a year just getting data infrastructure set up so that they could start building a product that added value to either a consumer, a realtor, or an agent's life. And what I decided to do at that point was build what I thought of as Stripe or Twilio, but for real estate data. And so that was the first time I launched a venture-funded developer platform. We went through an accelerator here called Grow Lab, which sounds like it's quite similar to Territory 3 in some ways. Good community, met a lot of people. we built the product with a very small team. So it was one where it was difficult for us to raise money because it was a niche market. Real estate was seen as a niche market. And we had a really ambitious goal about how we were going to standardize data and enable anyone to build software very rapidly. And the platform achieved that. But what the platform had a hard time achieving was just changing the industry mindset about real estate data. And for that reason, it became quite difficult to raise money. So I really perfected a craft at that time around hiring talent that the business could afford. I didn't have the money to hire the most senior person, the person who might have 10 years experience, know all of the different programming languages. But what did happen at that time, which I did have the opportunity to do, was hire new grads. And coincidentally, one of the things that emerged at that time was something called the Developer Bootcamp. There was a company here called Lighthouse Labs that I met the founder on their first day in Vancouver, a gentleman named Jeremy Shackey. And he said, hey, we're going to be training developers, junior developers, and helping them find jobs. And I said, hey, look, I'd love to hire some. And so what ended up happening is they ended up hiring out of all of the cohorts. And through that, I really had to think through, how am I going to help these, brand new developers be successful? And what are the things that I need to do as the CTO of that company to implement the tools that they need to be able to deliver value rapidly? And so we went through a process of doing that. And from that, that's where it was also during the time where DevOps or developer operations start to become very popular. And so what I thought of at that point was, look, while all of these other companies are struggling to hire the senior talent, the advantage I have as a technologist and a technology leader is being able to get access to a broader pool of talent that they may not be able to support. And if I can set up the right strategies, the right tools, the right processes, the right ways of working that allows these junior engineers to deliver value very quickly, that's going to give me a competitive advantage. So when I talk about DevOps, I don't really talk about Kubernetes or the AWS cloud. Like, there's a lot of technology things that we can talk about if we want to go there. But really, I think the message that I try to preach is DevOps is about creating a 10x environment. And a lot of people think that an engineer, a 10x engineer, is like one person who's 10 times better than everyone else. Sometimes people point to the HBO special Silicon Valley with the gentleman Carver, who's sort of this disgruntled engineer that codes so much better than everyone else. But the reality is, a 10x engineer is one person who can enable 5 people to be 2 times more productive. And what my strategy was all about at that time, because I didn't have the funding, was trying to find the talent that was really motivated to improve their career and give them that opportunity, give them the support. So I set up a number of really important DevOps strategies there that allowed us to grow our team. We grew our team in about 6-8 months to about 13 people. And what happened at that point is we actually got a call from a company called Zillow Group as we were raising our Series A. And Zillow is the largest real estate company in the US. They do about 300 million active users, have property data for every property in North America, and are about $30 billion market cap, I think, the last time I checked. And they reached out to us and just said, hey, we would love to acquire your business. And so that was the first startup that I built that was effectively acquired, sort of pre-product market fit, about 8 months in. I spent about 2.5 years at Zillow running their developer platform using the product that we brought into Zillow Retzley. And in doing that, I got to work with probably 50 or so different startups, mostly within the real estate sector, but sometimes in other areas. And what I had the opportunity to do is really start to look at how they operated. What are the tools that they build? How do they set up their systems? How can our platform integrate into those systems? And what I started to realize is that there's a really big challenge out there for startups, specifically startups who are having trouble hiring the talent that they need. And in this market, as I understand it, most startups are having a hard time hiring their engineering team, or hiring the senior engineers that they need to be successful, I should say. And so at that point, the sort of perspective I had and the contrarian view that I had about how to enable tech teams was actually something that was starting to emerge to be something that was in high in demand. And so after about 2.5 years at Zillow, I said my farewell. My wife and I were having our first child, and my team was ready to step up and sort of take the ball and run with it. And I stepped back and I said, okay, well, what do I want to do? And this was sort of the moment where CTO.ai started to become a thing. And what I had decided in the beginning of this business wasn't to build a SaaS company. That's not really what I was aiming for. What I actually was trying to do when I started the company was just invest into startups. I thought, hey, I have made a little bit of money from this exit. Maybe I can invest into some other founders, help them be successful. And that sort of kicked off a really interesting set of events that I couldn't really explain. What happened was, as I would try to invest money into these startups, maybe it was $25,000, $50,000, they kept trying to hire me as their CTO. And what they kept saying to me is like, Kyle, look, that money, sure, that's great, not that interested in it. What we actually need help with is on the technical side. We need to be able to grow our engineering team. We need to be able to spend dollars hiring our engineers. And we don't really have a good sense of like why we're seeing less productivity as our team grows. We don't know what inputs are driving what outputs. And I thought that was a really interesting proposition. And I was intrigued to solve it because of this thought that was sort of permeating through my mind. So I started working with these companies in an advisory capacity. And what I ultimately found was they didn't need a CTO. That wasn't really what they needed. But later, that's sort of how we positioned the name of the company. What they needed was DevOps, like I said earlier. They needed a set of working tools that made it super easy for anyone on their team to essentially deliver production code to any system easily and effective, regardless of their experience, regardless of their technical capacity. And what I was observing is as these companies were hiring, there was sort of this negative correlation between how many people they would hire and how much productivity that would be gained. And so we started implementing these practices sort of in a consulting manner. And one thing led to another. The company grew very quickly using a consulting methodology. And that consulting methodology produced a lot of value for these startups. It helped them really standardize their best practices. It allowed them to hire more junior developers. We really set a culture in most of these companies where we sort of set this idea that DevOps is defined by, can your team deploy? Can new people on your team deploy on day one? And how easy can you make it? And what this allowed these companies to do is really minimize the complexity that was eating away at the cycle time. And their developers were able to spend more time delivering software that actually enhanced the customer's experience. And that was ultimately what they were looking for. And so in doing that, it led me to a couple of things that ultimately meant I wanted to build another SaaS company and pursue venture funding. The company was sort of bootstrapped at that point. I put a little bit of money in. We grew it to about 60 people, about $10 million run rate using this sort of managed services model. But I started to realize that most of these startups had a very similar set of problems that could be solved with a very similar set of tools. And there was, most importantly, a very similar set of methodologies for measuring their effectiveness. And in 2018, September of 2018, a report came out from Stripe, and it's called the Developer Coefficient. And there was two statements in that report that really stood out to me and were the reasons that I shifted the business towards a SaaS business. The first statement was after surveying thousands of companies, the Stripe Coefficient reported that most executives feel that access to software development talent is a bigger threat to their business than access to capital. Meaning they're more threatened by the fact that they can't add enough software talent to hit their goals. And they're more threatened by that than whether or not somebody's going to invest in them. And that rang true to me based on the experience that I had. The second thing, which really put it over the top for me, was, but despite that, they also went on to say that companies are wasting about $300 billion in developer productivity every year. And what that led me to conclude was that there is a gap between the available talent that these companies are hiring, as well as the technology tools and products that they're trying to build. And so at that point, we had a very successful business, and I said, I think we can build another developer platform here, but we're going to have to pivot the company. So I looked at how to build it, and I thought there's a couple of different things that we needed to do. I thought, first of all, we need to build a set of objective measurements for how we measure the efficacy of software development in these organizations. And we need to be able to put that in front of founders and in front of tech leaders so they objectively know this is what good looks like. there were a lot of things around that time where, companies were trying to measure developer efficiency. They would measure code commits, number of code commits, these very individual metrics meant to typically stack rank their development team. And I really just didn't believe in that because I thought it actually broke down the fabric of culture and accountability. And so after a few years, something came out from the Devops Research Association called Dora metrics. And there's 4 key metrics I would suggest every tech team, every startup founder tries to get their team to measure. The first one's lead time for change. So across the team, what's the average cycle time that it takes for your team to move changes from an idea through to production? The second is deployment frequency. That's a measurement of how often is your team able to deploy to production, which therein is a measurement also of their confidence of how often they can deploy to production. Those 2 measurements are typically a really good measurement of velocity, and they're more authentic from an engineering and DevOps perspective than something like story points or agile metrics. So they're additive if you already have a product management culture. I really suggest using them because they're sort of the empirical evidence as to whether your product management assumptions are valid. And then the second 2 metrics in the Dora, in the 4 key Dora metrics are meant to measure stability. So the change failure rate or deployment failure rate, as it's sometimes called, is a measurement of how often do you deploy and introduce instability in your product. And mean time to failure, or mean time to recovery, is how quickly can you roll back. There's a set of methodologies that you can develop within how your team works to increase cycle time and really rapidly release things. Most teams that we work with, my team, a new developer deploys on day 1, and a developer can deploy an infinite number of times a day. That is a super rapid cycle time, but as you increase that velocity, you introduce the potential for instability. And so what these metrics allow you to do is increase cycle time, but then monitor that instability and set KPIs for how much instability are you willing to take on. And typically, as long as you can have a really rapid mean time to recovery, meaning you can recover from failures very quickly, this is the old fail fast thing that works very well within startup culture. And so the reason I share these 4 key metrics is I think they're objectively the best way to measure and then improve your software development practice in any startup. And it sets a really clear culture of expectation. But the other piece of this is the workflow. What is the workflow that your team uses? And how does that workflow abstract complexity? How does it create the ability to easily recover when there's things that fall back? Most companies will use something like GitHub. And so there's very simple and practical things you can do. I mean, everyone uses pull requests, but the question is, do you use something like GitHub Flow? Do you deploy from feature branches? What's your policy for merging to master? If something breaks within a feature branch, it's easy to just redeploy master if master's stable. But if what you're doing is once a week, merging all of your code, all of your changes into one big batch and releasing tens of thousands of lines of code, you're taking on more risk every time you deploy. So batching these down into very iterative cycle times is very, very important. So ultimately, as I developed this hypothesis around how we could use data and how we could start to build workflow tools that made things like continuous integration and delivery very easy. We had a lot of infrastructure as code and cloud integrations that we worked on. I started to decide that there was a case for venture capital in our business. And so after bootstrapping the business for about 2.5 years, I decided to take an opportunistic flight to the Bay Area to see about venture capital. And things kind of got out of control. The original kind of flight down was meant to be 4 days, meet with 15 firms on Sand Hill Road. And about 4 weeks later, I met with 115 VCs. On a flight home from that sort of one-way trip, I sat down on a plane, bought myself an upgraded ticket because it'd been a long 4 weeks up and down the Bay Area. And, sometimes luck just happens. Stuart Butterfield, who's the co-founder of Slack, sat down next to me. I kind of explained the business, told him what we were doing. And about 2 weeks later, we had a seed round, which was led by Tiger Global, which is one of the largest investors in the world, and also Slack, who was our strategic investor. And so what that meant is we had to rapidly adjust the business, ultimately going into COVID. And what I saw during that period was a very difficult and tumultuous time where obviously it's very difficult to keep your engineering team focused. And so we eventually transitioned the business through that period, built out the platform that we currently have, which is designed to enable any development team to build very intuitive workflows that are also measurable in the metrics that I just described. And the whole idea there is if we can help companies focus more of their energy on doing software development, that's going to help them drive more value to customers. They're going to be more successful. The last thing I'll say, and I'm happy to open this up to any questions or even feedback, is when you hear the word DevOps, I want you to think devs should be able to do operations. What often happens in these startups is as your team grows, typically you're going to get to 10 to 15 developers. Maybe you're at 20. You're going to start noticing that the technical founder is kind of overwhelmed. There's a bunch of things that they're responsible for, and you have this team who can't necessarily pick them up. And so the logic that most people go is, okay, I need to hire DevOps now. I need somebody to help the CTO. And what often happens is we'll hire somebody who's very experienced in operations. Maybe they have an traditional IT background. And what this can mean is we actually can really inflate the complexity of our software practices. And what we need to do within DevOps is we need to try to I always joke, we need to put the dev back in DevOps. The more you implement operational best practices in your growing technology team, that's awesome. Trust me, I think that these things are super important, but what most startups miss is you need to simplify that operational process to a point where the devs can do it on their own. You shouldn't need a DevOps to dev ratio of anything more than 1 to 10 in your first 10 to 20 engineers. If you grow past 20 engineers and you're adding 1 or 2 DevOps for even every 10 or 20 engineers, something is broken within your process. And you're going to have a difficult time scaling it because you're going to have a difficult time hiring the people who have the expertise with cloud engineering, infrastructure engineering, and deep tech. So what we advocate for is simple and intuitive tools that lower the level of complexity so your devs can do operations, and really clear KPIs and measurements that let your dev team know, your engineering team know, are they hitting the bar? When you put those things in place, my experience across probably like 25, 30 different startups that I've helped this with is you create a significant competitive advantage that accelerates your product delivery and mitigates any risks that you have from being able to hire the talent you need. And most importantly, what it'll do is it'll really level up your talent from the bottom up and create a culture where you're growing the capacity of your team. And my experience is that's the best way to retain software engineers.
Cool. Awesome. Some great info there, Kyle. I've just noticed there's one question that's come through in the Q&A asking around why CTO.ai doesn't have set prices on your website. Is it something you'd like to give?
Yeah. We're still taking feedback on it. Is the main reason. So we're sort of, again, like we're a mixture of a SaaS software with what we call a DevOps as a service model. So when we integrate our platform into a company to help them, there's some variability that we have to consider, like how much infrastructure do you already have? What are the processes you want to automate? We have very simple self-service pricing when somebody just comes on and wants to use the software themselves. It's very inexpensive, $50 a developer per month. But most of our customers, what they're actually looking for is a higher touch engagement. And so what we learned through our sort of like go-to-market process, which again, we're like 6 to 8 months into this cycle, is it's better for us to provide a tailored sort of pricing model in most cases for our customers, because that's what's actually going to add the most value to them.
Cool. Awesome. So everyone, we're just kind of opening this up now. That we'd love to, make this interactive. So please do chuck in any questions into the Q&A, anything into the chat as well. If there's, different topics that you'd be keen for Kyle to chat on with us. Yeah, just anything, that you'd love to be addressed. Please do chuck anything in there and we will get to it in the Q&A. I noticed there was a bit of...
some discussion about access to capital versus access to talent. So I don't know that this is the case for everyone, and certainly this is a generalism, don't get me wrong. But in this market where you have you have hedge funds like Tiger Global who are investing literally, hundreds of millions of dollars per week into companies. My experience in the macro setting is it's objectively harder to get access to enough software engineers than it is to get access to that capital. And most of the founders that I know in my circle, which may be privileged to some degree, they're able to get really great access to capital in this current climate. Like I know founders who are raising significant amounts of money because of, probably it's because of all of the money that's getting poured into the economy. But what they're still struggling with is how do I deploy that capital in the most efficient way to deliver the results that my team need or that my customer needs. And this is where the shortage of talent that's been documented through, McKinsey and down the line, it's a real challenge. I was talking to a very large consulting company in New Zealand, and I don't know New Zealand that well. I'd love to move there. But what they were sharing with me is one of their biggest strategies for hiring the technical talent they need is actually enabling immigration, because people want to move to New Zealand. We have the same thing here in Canada. People want to immigrate to Canada, but with the current environment, it's just puts a chokehold on immigration. And so ultimately, they're sort of in this position of like, okay, well, we can't bring new people in and train them. How are we going to get access? And the question becomes, how do I level up the team I have, help the team I have do more with the capacity that they have?
Cool. Question that's come through, any comments about how to measure those key metrics effectively?
Yeah, I'll selfish plug. We have a tool that clicks into GitHub, and we'll give it to you for free, and you can plug it in and start measuring those pretty quickly. There's other ways of doing it that are more self-service. You kind of have to instrument your system, send data to some sort of database, run the reports. There isn't a ton of tools like this out of the box, and that's why we created and started getting it out of free, because at least it starts stimulating that conversation about what are KPIs, what are the KPIs that matter within DevOps. And so, there's sort of the build it yourself approach, which certainly you can do if you have a CI/CD practice. You can instrument that to send analytic events and then build your own reports. But with the customers that work with us, they sort of just come in, plug in their GitHub, maybe instrument a light API call, and they start getting those metrics pretty quickly. And it shouldn't be something that requires you to build more infrastructure, is my opinion. So, if your process is pretty nuanced, you might even be able to just do the math in your head or on pen and paper. But as you start growing your team, this is where, especially if you need to have an arm's length because you're focusing on other things as a technical founder, you're going to want to have something where you can go look at a dashboard along the way.
And related to that, are there any barriers to using your platform, specific apps, that people use? Do they need to be on a certain set of those?
Yeah, our deepest compatibility is with GitHub. However, we can consume events from any system through an API call. When you build workflows on our platform, they require you to have a little bit of experience around containers, Docker, and how to write basic code JavaScript would do. And so it's sort of set up to be relatively simple for any developer who has some imagination about what they want to automate anything that they want and track that automation. Obviously, complexity can increase quite a bit depending on what systems you want to integrate. So if you want to do something like infrastructure as code, I highly recommend Terraform, or if you're on Amazon, definitely go with CDK. But these are the sorts of tools that can be really easily integrated into our platform. And we sort of built it to feel kind of like a Heroku and be as simple as a Heroku. So the barrier to entry isn't huge, but this is also why we will, try to sit down and offer advice and support for any customer we work with, because, you may be using some other technology that, I've never heard of or our product doesn't support. And there may be a different way for you to get what you want. And if that's something that we can identify and help you figure out, then happy to share that experience with you. It's not just about trying to get everybody onto CTO.ai.
Awesome. A question here from Roger is around that he looks for the top 1% in order to do the development, whereas you obviously are saying it's more important to level up your current devs. And he's just interested in if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you can get with the top 1%,
Mm,
absolutely do it. The challenge is just as you scale, it becomes fairly unsustainable. I know many developers who are getting offers of like literally like $750,000 to go work at some big tech co, and it's like there's no way I can compete with that, nor would I want to hold them back from that opportunity. I can't compete for that level, and so the question is like, how do you get creative as you scale? And the strategy that I think is frankly the best, it's kind of one I described. It's not like all junior, and I'm not saying go for the lowest quality talent. What I'm saying is how do you create leverage on talent? And so if you can get one person who's a 1% top quality person that you perceive as 1% level of quality, and then hire 10 more people who are in, say, the 60th percentile, but they learn from that 1%, they follow the patterns that 1% establishes and provides to them. This is that leverage that I'm talking about, and it allows you to widen your hiring funnel, and more importantly, you're going to actually get a higher return on that investment for each individual software engineer, especially if that 1% is coming at a premium. So I just think about it not as like, right and wrong, or yes or no, or 1%, or 99%. I think of it more as like a diversified strategy for hiring that enables you optionality. But no matter who you hire, you're focusing on enablement. And your strongest people, like their job is to enable the rest of the team to perform at that same level.
Awesome. A question from the chat from Chris Leonard. Do you think that services available from the Azure and AWS platforms will accelerate the operational aspects of development, i.e. continuous delivery is easy and the norm?
Yeah, I absolutely do. There's a lot of nuance in this, right? So it depends on like, there's so much nuance. Like if you're a heavy .NET shop or a heavy Microsoft shop, like obviously go to Azure. They're pretty vertically integrated. They have things like Azure Devops. You'll probably be pretty happy. If you're more of a Linux shop or a container, you're focusing on containers. If you want to be on the most global infrastructure, and get the most commodity prices at scale. I mean, AWS has got the most services out there. There's also, Google Cloud, DigitalOcean is an emerging leader. They offer things like Kubernetes as a service now. So I think the main thing is to have a clear understanding of what are the tools that will add velocity and decrease complexity versus what are the ones that will do the inverse. And one of the things that I see is people maybe focus a little bit too much on brand, or focus a little bit too much on technology. I constantly work with companies who are like, let's adopt Kubernetes. And then I ask them about their application. I ask them about their CI/CD environment. They're like, oh, well, we only run one application. We just have a single Node.js app. And to me, it's like, why do you want to learn Kubernetes, right? Your whatever your cloud strategy is, set it up so that it can be evolved over time. And objectively, in my opinion, you want to resist complexity as long as possible, because the more you add complexity, the more your team will slow down, and it's really hard to go backwards. This is why technical debt is such a painful thing. So if you adopt AWS, for example, start with something like Lambda, move to something like Beanstalk. As you start breaking down your applications, now what you may need is something like a CI/CD server. You may need multiple pipelines to deploy multiple services. You might want to look at ECS for container services. Do you want to manage servers, or do you want it to be serverless? Well, Aurora becomes a good option for databases, and something like Fargate becomes a really good option for not having to manage servers. Amazon went down yesterday. I don't know if anybody knows this, but US West 2A went down. And anybody who was running on that Amazon availability zone, frankly, saw some level of downtime. And so if you can leverage something like a Fargate or something like a Lambda, where Amazon just takes care of the distributed nature and all of the uptime, again, that's all hours that your developers are spending working on your product, not fixing downtime. So can it accelerate? Yes. It's probably one of the biggest savings that you can have. The question is just, how does your team utilize it, and how do you manage complexity over time? And I have a really great slide called Devops Over Time that I could share with somebody after the call if they're interested. But it kind of helps you understand like the evolution of complexity and how that complexity can really like slow down the pace of your software delivery.
Cool. Awesome. I just thought I'd chuck a little plug in there. AWS is a sponsor of Territory 3, and we have the org code for 10K credits through the Amazon Activate program. If anyone wasn't aware of that, just flick me an email and you can apply for Amazon Activate to get 10K, which can go up to 100K, but it's on a case-by-case basis. Just thought I'd chuck that in.
If you use the free tier, you can stretch it even further. So look into their free tier, add the Activate credits on top of it. I know lots of startups have been able to serve millions of requests a month for more or less break even on something like Lambda.
Awesome. Cool. A question here from Jesse. With remote work now becoming a norm, is it advisable to hire devs abroad that might not be able to immigrate to your country in the near future?
Yeah. I mean, this is a very difficult question. I'm reasonably contrarian in how I think about talent strategies. Maybe I've demonstrated that a little bit today. I absolutely think that you have to have a remote talent strategy. There's too much risk to your core business if you don't, because most companies are becoming remote companies now. Many will go back because, let's be honest, we all kind of miss that in-person connection, but a lot of companies won't. And what was happening before the pandemic is overwhelmingly software engineers were moving from centrally located companies to remote positions because they wanted the flexibility. A lot of times they're introverts. I mean, they want to focus and write code. Like, it's understandable why work from home would be such a benefit. I think many developers are rethinking that, but it's still kind of unclear about how that's going to stick afterwards. But what will be the norm is developers will expect the ability for a company to sustain hiring remote people. And frankly, again, if you're struggling to hire people in your local environment, right, your local geography, it's obviously important to be able to get that in-person time, especially when you're small and you're a well-aligned team. But as you grow, if you can't look to the best talent in the world, let's see, how do you find that 1% of talent? You're not going to find that in one geography. You're competing on the internet, most startups, right? So you have to look to the broader world and try to find that talent. So some tips on that. We're a company who was completely centrally located in Vancouver, completely shifted to remote. We have people in Canada, United States, and Mexico. The number one most important thing for remote talent strategy is time zone alignment. The second is creating like an even playing field, especially if you're in a hybrid environment. Most experts, most founders that I've talked to, and Zapier really talked about this a lot before everyone was remote, but it's like really bad. It's really difficult if you have a two-tier system where there's maybe like two of us in an office and we're on a big screen and we're talking, but everyone else is on their laptop. So there's just a lot of cultural things you can kind of put in place to balance that. And I would highly encourage people to kind of read the like remote playbook. I think it's called the GitLab, documents all of their remote processes openly. Definitely look at that. HashiCorp has something called How. Definitely look at that. The reason I call both of those out is they're very engineering-centric companies, so it'll help to highlight some of the things that they've thought through with their staff of thousands of engineers. But aside from that, look to someone like a Zapier who really kind of like wrote the early playbook on remote only. Just be careful about a hybrid model. It's quite difficult to manage, and it creates a two-tier model. In my opinion, you either go remote or don't. And I think everyone has to have some remote flexibility in the sort of upcoming years, right?
Cool. Some good insights there. The question from Daniel is just asking, is this all quite different with hardware engineers and other types of talent?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think Moore's law applies, maybe, is kind of one way to describe this. Like, I would suspect in whatever the prior industrial revolution would have been, where hardware was like, that thing that investors were pouring crazy capital into, like, I expect it would have been the exact same thing. I think now the market has shifted a little bit, and I'm not that experienced with hardware, but I have worked quite a bit with mentoring startups who are sort of not what I would call internet first companies. Quite a few companies that I mentor out of Creative Destruction Lab, they come out of literally a lab in a university, and they're like biologists, and they have like 7-year timeframes to try to create solutions that might like cure cancer, like this kind of stuff, right? One of them that I know, they literally like 3D print livers. This is like, and so there's all kinds of crazy technology that you are going to need to hire for. I don't really specialize in that, so I don't know that I can offer much value. I imagine it's different, and I would think that you're going to have a very different hiring strategy. You're probably going to look more to the youth universities and the academics. Whereas software, I don't think you need to require a software degree. I'm a little bit biased because I don't have one, but I think software is the most accessible thing on the planet for people to learn. And so I hire less for like skills and less for necessarily like proven skills and experience, as I do for tenacity, ability to learn, alignment with team, mindset in the software category. And this is what allows me to open up my hiring funnel. Like some specialization is valuable. Like I want to know that you know the basics, but I believe that there's no environment where you can more rapidly upskill your team than in software. And I would imagine that's not going to necessarily carry over to something like hardware or something that requires more like a PhD to achieve. And let's be honest, software doesn't require a PhD. I'm a high school dropout and built some of the biggest software systems in the world. It's like it's accessible. People can learn it.
Cool. Awesome. Question here from Chris. Have you ever thought about driving ambition as a value across dev teams in order to get them to focus on outcomes rather than outputs?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So when you go with like raw ambition, or you kind of like impose it's a really difficult one. Like, so people have suffered a lot of burnout in the last 12 to 18 months, right? Like there's never been a time where people are more experiencing that burnout. And there's never been as much a time that I can imagine, or I can remember in the last 20 years at least, where the public conversation on, amongst the tech community was about managing and self-care and like these things, right? So I think you have to be really careful about how much you drive hustle culture into engineering team. Let's be honest, engineers aren't Gary Vee, and Gary Vee's the only one who's Gary Vee, and Gary Vee wouldn't be a very good software engineer, nor would Grant Cardone. So I think what you want to focus on is logical accountability, right? And the reason I focus on those metrics is that they can help you establish a culture of shared accountability and standards. My experience is that software engineers care more about quality and standards than they do about ambition. They want to work smarter, not harder. And you want them to work smarter, not harder. And so I think while it's important to have a team that bands together and is willing to put in that extra time to get the ball into the touchdown, it can also be something that like works backwards against you if that's all it is. And it's constantly what I call a death march. And if your team is going through a death march, they're going to leave you. And so again, it's like not about really like pushing ambition. It's about making it easy for them to exceed expectations by investing into the things that they need. And then I think once they see that success, well, then the question is, how do you reinforce their mindset as a team about reaching and being ambitious about how they reach forward? But, you don't want to put teams on a death march. No one should ever deploy alone. You really have to think more about how you measure the things that lead to ambitious outcomes than trying to instill ambition, because it's a very tricky one, especially when people have experienced as much burnout as happened across the world in the last 24 months.
Cool. Question here from John. When you hire your devs, how do you measure tenacity, ability to learn, and the other talents that you've mentioned?
Great question. Problem solving. This is one that I'm still working on how to break this down into something that is a scorecard, frankly. And there's a really good book called Who that talks a lot about like how to identify who you want to hire and how to like create a structure around that. The number one thing that I focus on when I'm hiring people is problem solving. And I don't care about what your university degree is. I don't care about whether you can solve algorithms or write an algorithm. I don't care if you understand what binary trees are or any of that computer science stuff. What I care about is, can I present you with a problem? Can you break that problem down into a set of steps that you're going to take and prioritize those steps in a way where you're going to get the highest outcome, highest chance that you're going to solve the problem? And I really want to understand what happens when you run into roadblocks No developer knows the answer to any question you ask them until they Google it, frankly. And except for some people who have more experience have the ability to internally reference experiences they've had and start prioritizing that path forward and then communicate that to others. And so the number one thing I think an engineer's job is to do is to problem solve. And even if we're talking about building new technology in a greenfield environment, like it's a problem solving exercise. It's almost like troubleshooting or reasonable deduction. I'm giving you an outcome you need to achieve. I can only give you so much objective definition about what we're looking for. And what I want to measure is how do you deal with uncertainty and how do you fill in the gaps? There's a very good quote from Ben Horowitz in The Hard Thing About Hard Things, which is a bit of a hustle culture book, but this isn't so much about hustle culture. He says, I don't care about statistics. I only care about calculus. And the reason that that resonates with me in this situation is an engineer's job is fairly logical. And what they're trying to do is solve an equation where if they put these variables in place, the outcome that you want is achieved. And so I think of it literally as almost like a problem solving exercise where I try to put problems in front of people and then work through them with them and sort of introduce new variables along the way. But what I also love to see is a software engineer in an open environment, such as an open source. And so my favorite thing is when somebody can send me pull requests that they worked on in an open community where there was some stated problem on a project that they maybe or were using in one of their jobs, and they worked through creating the solution and maybe even had dialogue with the maintainers. Barring that, I typically ask somebody to bring up something that they have, that they've worked on, that they think represents their abilities. And then I just walk through it with them. I would avoid take-home tests, coding exercises. All those do is slow your devs down. And frankly, like, there's enough demand that's coming into the inboxes of these software engineers where they don't need to take a day off work to write your coding tests. You will lose them. But if you can get them to just bring it up on the screen with you, talk through the problem, talk through it with a technical stakeholder, your CTO, whiteboarding system architecture, if it's more of like a DevOps engineer, and I'm asking them about why they make certain trade-offs. And, okay, if you had that, what would that enable? If you added this, what would that enable? What's the benefit to the business? It helps you really understand kind of like how they think about technology and technology's purpose in adding to the business, as well as just like what's their problem solving skills. And let's be honest, everything in the startup is like a problem you're trying to solve, right?
Cool. A question earlier from Justin is around the metrics that you mentioned. How well would those work in a small team of, say, only 4 devs?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the 4 key metrics that you mentioned that you measure, how would that apply in terms of a very small dev team?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a question of like ROI, right? So if you were going to spend a bunch of time setting this up, I'd say don't do it. You probably just report it on paper. And frankly, in my experience, when I was growing my teams along the way, up until 10, 12 developers, I could hold it in my head, and do the math in my head and kind of have a sense. It's once you get to that next level where it starts to break down, or if you don't have that sort of intimate knowledge of developer tools and that intuition for it. Let's say you're a less technical founder, right? In that regard, it can be helpful at any stage. At any stage, putting something in place that helps people measure what the business cares about is helpful. It's going to be obviously not as impactful at 4 engineers, but it will set a culture early of what those developers care about. And as you hire the next set of engineers in, those people, let's go 5, 6, 7. Well, now there's this self-reinforcement model of what we care about as engineers is making sure that we have the autonomy to build the best software. And the way we have the autonomy to build the best software is we focus on hitting these things that the business cares about, right? And so it can be something that the earlier you adopt it, the better. But it's not going to be as effective or as important at 4 just because the amount of data and the software delivery. That said, DevOps in general is great for small teams because if you implement it early, it means you can keep your team smaller and still have the same level of impact. And in my perfect environment, perfect world, I have the smallest dev team possible. Because software development salaries are honestly one of the most expensive cost centers in a startup, especially one that does a lot of R&D. So It's not always realistic. Sometimes you got to build a lot of stuff. But you look at something like a Stack Overflow, where it's a very small team, or even Instagram, the scale they had with a very small team for a very long time. That is very what we call 10x or high leverage engineering. And I think that's admirable. It's something to aim for. So the more you can reinforce that small team, let them do more, the better. Big splash, small pond.
Awesome. I think we'll just make this our last question from Max. Who is the buyer of your product, and what are your best converting channels for them?
Good question. Channels we're still figuring out. We're not really like a marketing heavy company. Like, we try to more focus on authentic conversations and be pretty engineering focused. So like stuff like this is always good, not necessarily for sales, but like to really get connected with companies and understand how to evolve our product. Our buyer, we have sort of two buyers that we think of. Our buyer is typically, what we think of as we'll just say a CEO, but it's a business user who doesn't have as much experience with what good and bad means in software engineering. And they typically are big on the insights product, because they actually want to understand what engineering cares about and work with engineering to hit those KPIs. So they tend to be the person who really is stoked on reporting, because they don't always get the full story from product management story points, frankly. And then our bigger buyers, typically the tech lead, the engineering manager, the VP of engineering, or the CTO. It just depends on the stage of the company. Again, we work with really large companies, but also startups. In most of the startups we're working with, and the startups we work with recently have raised something in the order of magnitude, something like, I think it's like $500 million in the last 12 months. It's typically going to be, the lead DevOps engineer. And most of those teams are growing, maybe 30, 40 devs, and being able to sort of have just one or two DevOps engineers. And that's where they really like the automation tools, because the more they can create self-service automation for the devs, the easier it is for them to scale up their dev team. And they don't necessarily need to hire as many DevOps engineers, which is just generally difficult in the North American environment, regardless of how much of you hire. So it's basically the business side leader and the technical side leader.
Cool. Awesome. Just about to wrap up. Now, in terms of if anyone is interested in getting involved with CTO.ai, what is the best way to contact? And I just saw you can do demos as well via the website. Was that what you would recommend if anyone is keen to learn more?
Yeah, I mean, come on to the website, check it out. You can sign up for free and kind of like get started. We'll reach out. If you don't want to do that, maybe even just drop me an email at kc@cto.ai. Especially for this group, I'd be happy to sit down, give my time, like really understand what's your unique situation and whether you use our platform or not, just give you feedback, because this is one of those things where it's like, there isn't really a book on it, frankly. So if I can share a little bit about the challenges I've faced and the experience, then that's helpful. And maybe over time, as you grow your team, there's things that we can help with. But come to the product, check it out. I think it's very accessible. Anyone can sign up, and we're not going to drop some crazy fee on you right out of the gate. We want to make sure that you're actually accelerating your product delivery and not having to worry about scaling up your DevOps, but also being able to level up your dev talent.
Cool. Cool. And so it looks like we're going to wrap up now, being 11 a.m. NZ. But awesome. Thanks so much to Kyle for coming in, sharing some amazing insights. And yeah, do get in touch with him if you're keen to chat further. But yeah, big thanks to Kyle for being here with us today.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And I'll just send a couple notes in the chat. If there's any questions I didn't answer, feel free to follow up as well. I didn't see the QA screen, but thanks for having me.